Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So a while back, I made a video about Incus and promised to keep you informed about any changes to the Incus project. And today I don't specifically have any changes on the Incus project, but something highly related to it. So Incus is basically the Linux containers fork of LXD, whereas the LXD project is going to remain closer to canonical in the future. So I've covered a product, a GUI management product called LXD Dashboard many times on the channel, and it's what I use to manage the LXD containers frequently when I'm not using the CLI. So beginning with the Incus fork, API endpoints for containers and virtual machines that LXD supported have been removed from the Incus code, and that was one of the first changes that the Incus project made. So for right now, you may want to have an Incus server for testing and evaluation, and I do after my video that I did on Incus. So LXD Dashboard will continue to support the older API endpoints, but LXD Dashboard will not be supporting Incus. So Penning Labs has a new product called LXConsole, which is designed to support both LXD and Incus servers. So why make a new console? Well, with the removal of the legacy API interface from Incus, the older LXD, and that means LXD servers before 4.0, are unsupported. The new API allows for support of both the newer LXD and the Incus servers. So I spoke with the author, Matthew Penning. And by the way, Matthew Penning was behind LXDware and LXD Dashboard, and he has plans to support both LXD and Incus servers in his new LXConsole project in the future. So for those of you still running Ubuntu 18.04, LXD Dashboard will continue to support you for your LXD server. And LXConsole is very new, and presently it's only at version 0.4.0, whereas LXD Dashboard is at version 3.8.0. So let's go take a look at LXConsole and see how we can install and configure it. So here we are over on the GitHub page for LXDware LXD Dashboard, which by the way was Matthew Penning's project also. But as we scroll down, we can see that the current release was version 3.8.0, and it was released on August 31st of this year, 2023. And so when I talked to Matthew, I didn't get the impression that this project would lose support, but I got the impression that it will not ever support Incus. So as we move over to his other GitHub page, which is for something called Penning Labs, LXConsole here is of course a fairly brand new project, and it is currently only at version 0.4.0, and it's kind of at a pre-release now. But I'll show you how to install it and configure it on your system. So let's look at a few basic comparisons. To begin with, this is LXD Dashboard, and we're on the main page after logging in, and you can see my various servers I have down here, which are VMS Mist, VMS Rain, VMS Cloud, VMS Fog, and Mondo. And they're all managed through port 8443 over to the API. In contrast to that, here's the LXConsole main screen, and I've got the same servers. And in addition to that, I also have two servers whose node name is Incus. As it turns out, the one that's managed at port 8443 is the LXD server, And then when I initialized Incus, I initialized it that the API or network interface would be at port 8445. And if you watch my Incus video, you can see that. Going back to the LXD Dashboard interface, I'm going to go over to my VMS Range server, and this is where the changes start to become apparent. So here I have 31 containers and 2 virtual machines, and on the left-hand margin, they're listed as containers and virtual machines. When I go over to LXConsole and go to the same machine, VMS Rain, you don't see a containers and virtual machines on the left-hand margin. Instead, you just see the word instances. And then over here, we have the choice of going to containers or virtual machines. Just to keep you hopping and to bounce back over to LXD Dashboard, I'm going to go ahead and click on containers over here, and then I'm going to go over to LXConsole and click on containers. So if we back up over here to LXConsole and look at the containers, you'll notice that it just gives a list of containers, and then if we wanted to get to LXD virtual machines, we would go over to the left margin and click on virtual machines. In the case of LXConsole, since we don't have that option over here, we have a tab at the top which says, do you want to look at containers or virtual machines? If I click on virtual machines, it lists my virtual machines. If I click on containers, it lists my containers. So let's go into a specific container on LXD Dashboard, and I'm going to click on my first container, which is bnotes. So here we have a series of selections across the top for overview, config, snapshots, profiles, and so on. And then we have some basic summary information and CPU and memory usage. When we move over to LXConsole and we click on bnotes, we instead get the screen that has tabs at the top for home, configuration, devices, console, and exec. And so basically things have been moved around quite a bit and provided just in a little bit different format. This LXConsole homepage gets a little bit interesting because the very first thing we see at the top are interfaces. And since I'm looking at a LXD container that has Docker nested inside of it, we can see lots of different network interfaces here in the list rather than just the typical ETH0 Ethernet device and the loopback device. Then when we scroll down, we have a list of whatever snapshots exist for this container. And then if we move further down, we have a list of the backups. And we move further down, we have the logs and log files down here. The way that this home screen is laid out, it ends up exposing quite a few of the commonly used functions for the end user. And if we scroll up to snapshots, for example, and go over to the right side and hit the hamburger menu, I have the ability to create a snapshot. And if I click create snapshot, we get a create snapshot screen up that looks just like LXD Dashboard's create snapshot screen. The other nice thing about this home page is if you look at this right-hand side with what they call general data, you can see we have a CPU indicator, a memory indicator. It tells you the status of the container, whether it's running or not. And then, of course, up here we have this block that we can press that will stop the container because it is running. And then it would show a play button if it were stopped, and you could click on that and start it. But it goes on and says what your profiles are. So for this particular container, my profile was default and also VLAN 80. It mentions what the image was that this container was originally created from. It mentions what the creation date of this container is, CPU utilization, memory utilization, swap partition utilization, and the number of processes running on this particular container. Then at the upper right-hand corner, we have something called Instance Actions. And in fact, on every screen of LXConsole, you have an Actions menu in the upper right-hand corner. And the actions that are applicable in this particular case are the ones that are highlighted. For example, rename is not a highlighted action here. And the reason for that is because the container is running and we can't rename a running container. If we now move from the Home tab at the top of the bNotes instance over to the Configuration tab, we have a very minimalistic layout here showing you the various options. For example, in the boot options, it says that our boot.autostart is set up to true. We have a cloud init screen. We have a limits screen that provides information on limits for a particular container, memory, CPU, and so on. We have a migration screen. We have a screen for NVIDIA drivers. We have a screen for other, a screen for raw, and a screen for security. So for example, in this particular case on the channel, I always mention security.nesting equal to true, and that shows security.nesting equal to true. And then finally, we have a snapshot screen down here where you can establish, or you can see what the snapshot schedule and schedule settings are. Then we can go over to the devices screen. On the devices screen, we can see what disk devices are attached to this particular container, what GPU devices are attached, what network devices are attached, if there are any proxies, and then some of the settings for Unix devices like a Unix block device that I've covered on the channel before. And finally, your USB connections if you have attached a USB device to your container. The other tabs we have up here besides Home and Configuration are Console and Exec, and those are pretty much identical to the screens we had before. There's Console, and you can start a console, and it'll give you a username prompt. Here's Exec, and that goes ahead and goes right into the root user and allows you to create a user account on a new container. So nowhere up here did I see any options to change this particular configuration, and that's because since we're in Instance bNotes, you're always going to want to gravitate up to the Actions menu in whatever screen you're in. So if I go up to Actions and I click Edit, this is where it brings up the ability to edit all of those things. So this screen is very similar to what LXD Dashboard has as an edit screen for the configuration. I don't know, but I see possibly that may change as this project moves forward. And in fact, what you'll find is as you dive to the deeper levels of menus, those menus for right now seem to be identical to the menus that we had in LXD Dashboard. So I'll be really excited to see what we have in the future. For right now, the really exciting part of this project is if we go back up to servers, I mentioned earlier that the server that is managed by port 8445 is actually an Incus server, and that was from my previous video where we talked about how to set up Incus. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and now I'm in an Incus server, and in fact the same Incus server that I used in my Incus video. And it goes ahead and displays everything about that server at the top level that you would expect. If I click on my containers, we get the same kind of interface here. Of course, if I go over to virtual machines, there are no virtual machines on this particular Incus server. And if I go to containers, it's not displaying the LXD containers, it's actually displaying just the Incus containers on this server. So the interface is pretty much the same. It operates pretty much the same. You can create containers, you can modify containers and operate on them through the GUI, and you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you were working on an Incus container or a LXD container. So here we are at the command prompt on my LXD server, and we're going to put our installation of LXConsole in a LXD container. So here we have a LXC launch Ubuntu :2204. I'm calling the name of the container LXConsole, and I'm including both the default profile and the bridge profile. If you haven't watched my video on LXD step by step, that's where we explain how we get the bridge profile and how we bridge LXD containers to our main LAN. Then we have boot.autostart equals to true, which means that when the LXD server starts, this container starts. And finally, we have security.nesting equal to true. And what that means is it means that we're able to nest Docker containers inside of our LXD container. Now that the container is created and started, I'm going to do a LXC shell LXConsole to move inside the container to the root account. A best practice in entering a new LXD container that's just been created is to do an apt update and an apt upgrade, and we put the -y on the end so that we won't be prompted as to whether or not we want to accept the updates. Next, we're going to do an add user on Scott in order to create myself a user account, and I give that user account a password. Now I go ahead and do a user mod -a capital G sudo Scott, putting Scott into the sudo group. Now I'm going to SU over to the Scott account, and the dash means also move me to Scott's home folder. If we do a pwd, you can see that we're in /home/Scott. Now let's go ahead and install Docker with the script from the Docker website. We provide our sudo password and Docker gets installed. Now that Docker's installed, we're going to do a sudo apt install on Docker compose. We're going to put Scott into the Docker group so that we don't have to use sudo to perform Docker commands. And the way we're going to do that is sudo user mod -a capital G Docker Scott. And in order to make that active, if we do a groups command right now, you can see that I'm only in sudo and Scott. We can say new grp Docker. And if we do the groups command again, you'll see that I'm in the Docker group as well. Now we're going to clone the LXConsole project files down to my local machine with the git clone command. If we do an ls, we're going to next move into LXConsole, which is the folder where the files were placed, and do an ls. If you'll notice, we have a Docker file here, and so we're going to do a Docker command or a Docker build command in order to execute the creation of the container. Now that the Docker images are built, we're going to go ahead and do a nano on docker-compose.yml. And in this file, we're going to go ahead and insert this. So we have here port 5000 inside the container that the author created, but we're exposing this to port 80. And the reason we're doing that is because port 80 is available since our LXD container is devoted to just this particular application. And then it's pointing to our image that we just built on the system with the Docker build command. And then finally, I have a pointer from the folder inside the container called /opt/LXConsole/backups, which is where backups occur. And I'm exposing those back to my home folder, which is /home/Scott/LXD images. And you can adjust that for your purposes. So I'm going to do a Control-O and hit enter to write the file out. and a Control X to exit the Nano editor. To create and launch our container, we simply do a Docker space compose up-D, and it should launch the container. And now that it's started, if we do a Docker space compose space PS, you can see that it is up and running. We need to find out what address our LXD container is running at, so I do an IP space A, and I look for the ETH0 device, which in this case is at the bottom, and it's running at address 172.16.1.63. Now I go into my web browser at address 172.16.1.63, and it brings up the registration screen. I provide my username, my email address, my password, and I confirm my password a second time, and I click sign up. Next, it brings you to the login screen where I type my username and I type my password, and I'm logged in. We have to add a server before we can manage it, so we press the plus server option in the upper right hand corner, and then we can go ahead and type in VMS Rain, which is the server that I want to manage. If I click on submit, I'm going to get an error that says that this certificate may not be trusted by this server. So we want to go ahead and do an add again, and notice here it says click here for instructions. Click there. What we want to do is we want to copy this certificate, including the begin certificate and end certificate, and we copy that into our cut buffer. Next, we head down to the command prompt, and we want to log in to the LXD server that we want to trust. So in this case, it's VMS Rain, and I'm going to go ahead and edit this LXConsole.crt, and I'll paste in the certificate we just cut. I do a Control O and Enter to save out the file, and a Control X to exit the Nano editor. Now if we head back to the web page screen, below the certificate, you'll see that there is both a command for installing a certificate for LXD and for Incus. In this particular case, this is a LXD server, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go back to the terminal, and I'm going to paste this command in. And finally, if we go back here, we can go down to the next section, which says that you should be setting your core address space so that clients can connect to this. And so I go ahead and do a Control V on that command as well. At this point, I can dismiss this screen, and then I have VMS Rain typed in here, which is the name of the server that we are connecting to. And then port 8443 was obtained when we did the LXD init, when we originally created that LXD server. At this point, I can click submit, and it adds that server. I can click on the server, and there it is. So if that didn't work for you because it couldn't find your name, VMS Rain, or whatever your name happened to be, you can also enter the address of the server directly, and it will use that instead. To add an Incus server, I press plus server again. I click here in order to get the certificate. I make a copy of that same certificate that we did with VMS Rain. I come back to the command prompt, but this time I'm on a command prompt on the Incus server, and I do a nano LXConsole.crt, and I go ahead and paste that certificate in there, do a Control O and Enter to write that out, and a Control X to exit the editor. The next thing I do is a command for Incus config trust add to add the certificate, which I got from the command further down here, Incus config trust add certificate, And then the last thing that I do is an Incus config set core address. And what that's for is to control which clients can connect to this server in order to perform operations. But on this particular server, I didn't use port 8443 when I initialized Incus, since I had a LXD server using port 8443. So in this case, it's port 8445. Now I can head back to the web interface and I can go ahead and dismiss it. We're going to add in a server called Incus, but our port number is going to be 8445 and not 8443. I click on submit and it adds the Incus server. Now if I click on the Incus server and I go look at containers, you remember from my Incus video, I had created 3 containers called Incus 1, Incus 2, and Incus 3, and here they are. So now we have a fully installed LXConsole. So in summary, LXConsole has added some very nice GUI elements that improve the user interface experience over what we have with LXD Dashboard. And I run both LXD Dashboard and LXConsole, and I plan to migrate solely to LXConsole as it matures. So LXConsole allows you to be Incus ready by supporting both LXD and Incus servers. Matthew Penning is doing some great work, and support him if you can over at github.com Penning Labs. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.